Okay, I think we're going to get started. We're so grateful that you're all here. Thanks for taking the time to, do what you had to do to be here. And we're really happy that we're going to hear from some amazing panelists tonight. And hopefully all of us, like Regina was saying before everyone came on, hopefully all of us will leave, even the panelists will leave more informed and get gears turning. Our objective with this webinar is really to flesh out different types of land back and the ways in which we are rematriating lands back to Indigenous peoples. So our objective is to educate and get inspired about different ways that we can assist the return of stolen lands to Indigenous peoples and return Indigenous peoples to their lands as well. As you know, many of us have been removed from our homelands, whether it's the Trail of Tears or the Long Walk or various relocation efforts. And it's time for us to return home as well and stop living like refugees in our own land. Another objective of this webinar is to encourage us to be a part of this movement and help us understand ways in which we can be a part of this movement. As you saw in the tagline, it's like the role of allies and accomplices. How can we be in solidarity with those Indigenous groups who are bringing back lands to their peoples? And we're going to have about an hour of discussion with our three panelists who are amazing and wonderful, and I'm so grateful that they're here. Then we're going to have about 30 minutes of Q&A, which I'm sure will be very interesting and won't be long enough. And before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the word accomplice. It's funny, if you look up accomplice in the dictionary, it says to assist someone in a crime. So it sounds kind of funny, like we're wanting to do criminal stuff, but what that really comes from, is back in the day, it was actually illegal to aid and abet the liberation of peoples who had been enslaved, for example, in the South. And so we're not asking, it's ironic because we're not actually asking anyone to engage in criminal behavior by becoming an accomplice. It's actually the contrary. We're trying to expose the ways in which the US law system actually breaks its own laws and actually has made it illegal to simply be decent and be respectful to all nations. So that was just a little side note that I wanted to talk about. And the root of that word accomplice and what we mean is somehow the American legal structure has made it illegal, not only in the past to aid and abet folks who were trying to be liberated from slavery, but also even the treaties and the laws are being broken every day. And it's now so hard to simply protect our lands and protect our waters. We're going to start with Regina Whiteskunk. We are so lucky to have her here with us tonight. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves just for about 3 minutes. I'm sure I could read a long bio, but I wanted to give you all a chance to introduce yourselves to folks who are here. So if it's okay with you, Regina, we'd love to start with you, and just feel free to introduce your organization, perhaps your background of your work, and your tribal affiliation, if you would.
Thank you, Lila. Again, Mike Wone, to all my relatives and relations out there. My name is Regina Lopez Whiteskunk. I am of the Uinta and Weemanooch bands. I'm enrolled with the Ute Mountain Ute tribe in the southwestern corner of Colorado in the community of Toyac. I was formerly seated as a tribal council member for one term and had the honor to be during that time, be one of the co-chairs for the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. I currently work for Montezuma Land Conservancy in Cortez in Montezuma County. And I also am a Masters of Environmental Management candidate with Western Colorado University in Gunnison. And I just want to say thank you to all those who are here this evening to share some time with us. It's more than a privilege and an honor to share and help others gain a better understanding. So again, thank you.
Thank you. And we're so lucky to have Doreen Martinez here. If you would do the same, Doreen, please introduce yourself to the webinar participants. And thank you for being here, Doreen. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I actually want to thank everybody for spending an evening, and I don't know if for you all that are in Colorado, a darker evening than last week, as the clocks have been moved forward or backwards. I don't know what it is, but it's weird because like I see myself very differently because I'm not used to being so dark out here. And the cat is also here, so she's gonna join us because it's that time for her. She doesn't know that the clock has changed. And I found it a little kind of ironic this morning in some ways in terms of introducing yourself. This is probably one of the hardest things I do is introduce myself. I'll be honest with you. And in that there's a number of things that come to me in terms of that. And one of the things I'm thinking of right now when you ask me that is to think about my grandparents, some Muscalero Apache, and my paternal grandparents. They were both born in what we know of kind of the 1890s. Again, there's no birth certificates, that kind of stuff. And they were born in Apache territory. So there's this way in which land is resonating in terms of kind of what that means in space and what that means in existence, what that means in lineage that you evoked for me. And I'm thankful for that. That's one of the things I think that what it means to be in this movement is, what do we hear? What are we listening to by some of the offerings and potentially even just a question that somebody brings to you? In that, that's presence. And then you move forward just a little bit in terms of our time here. Again, just trying to do a short intro, which is always hard when you also get 3 minutes, because I'm like, I don't want to be too short. So I go back there in terms of, this land that literally didn't have these boundaries, right? Not the kind of boundaries in which we're actually having to attend to, and the borders that were there. And I remember very vividly one time my nephew was like, well, where were your grandparents born? And I'm like, Apache territory. He's like, well, what was that in the US? I'm like, no, it was Apache territory. And he's like, was it in Mexico? I'm like, no, it was Apache territory. Like, and even in a very quick generational way, people can forget, what land was and what land means and where we come from. So I think about it in that kind of, literally that kind of spirit that also is something that's very embodied in terms of what I carry. So what I carry and where I can carry that in these spaces in the formal way, and I'll just say it in terms of who actually writes my paycheck, because that's a way in which we can understand this, as I am a professor of Indigenous Studies at Colorado State University. In the other ways, I'm not going to say informal, but in the other ways, because there's all these other ways in which we do this kind of presence, not just work, but the presence. I'm very involved in a number of different community projects, a number of different projects on tribal communities, and I've been doing that for over 30 years. So here's a little tidbit for today, is that I had to go get a new driver's license. And they read off like, oh, so you live at this address? Yes. You're this height? Yes. You're about this weight? Yes. Your eyes are brown? I'm like, yes. And he's like, your hair is brown. And then he looks at my hair and I'm like, well, it was like, he's like, I guess it's gray now. So I'm only making that reference because I guess I have to own that I've been traveling this earth for a little bit now. So I'm just adding that into our conversation today in terms of been doing this, since I was born, again, but in these structured ways, easily over 30 years. So again, thank you all for coming tonight. And I'm looking forward from learning from you all as much as sharing what we know.
Oh, thank you so much, Doreen. We're so appreciative to have your experience here tonight. And I'd like to go to Crystal. And please, thank you so much for being here. We know you bring all the power of Indie in collective with you, which is such a beautiful force to be reckoned with these days. It's beautiful to see you guys organizing. We're so grateful that you're here. Would you be open to introducing yourself a little bit?
Yes, thanks, Lila. Epeveshev, Mene Wostat Nanehev, Crystal Tubals. I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, calling in from Northern Cheyenne territory. As Lila said, I'm the LANDBACK campaign director. I work with an organization called Indian Collective, We're based out of Rapid City, South Dakota, in the heart of Ochete Shakoi territory, in the Hesapa, in the Black Hills. And yeah, I mean, I'm first and foremost, like, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm an auntie, I'm a relative in my community. And so just have a lot of gratitude for each one of you for spending time with us this evening. I know the conversation, there's sometimes fear attached to this conversation. And I know that we can be in many different places this evening, asleep for one, or, hanging out with family, but we chose to be here this evening. And so just a lot of gratitude for each one of you, and, just appreciation to the organizers of this event as well. Check.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, and it's an honor to have you all here. I love too that it's a panel of femme identifying folks, and at least that's what I understand. And it's just wonderful to see the women of our nations to be upholding our responsibility to take care of the land and take care of the people as leaders. I was on another webinar today. We really talked with the Onondaga and Haudenosaunee nations about the role of rematriation and really restoring women's leadership, and how back in the day in our nations, yeah, the women were the leaders, and there was no qualms about that. It was kind of a no-brainer. If we want to be here for the next generations, who should we talk to but the mothers of that next generation? And we're gonna go into the next question, which is really simple, which is, what does land back mean to you? And I think this is a really important question that each of you will answer, because land back is seemingly a somewhat of a new catchphrase. And I'm so glad that it is a catchphrase, because we've been trying to talk about this for a long time, about how the very substructure of what we now call America is legally and in reality, in a physical sense, based on the theft of indigenous lands. And there was this idea when people first came here that this land was terra nullius, which means no man's land in Latin. And so when explorers, maybe more like pirates, came here, they said, oh, it's terra nullius, and they reported back to the kings and queens that, oh, no man's land. But actually it was a man's land, and it was a woman's land, not so much in the sense that we owned it, but this was our obligation and our responsibility to steward this land, and Creator put us here to take care of it, which is why it hurts so much for Native folks to see the land get polluted and destroyed and extracted from, because it is our duty to protect it, and we're still fighting every day to do that. It was our sacred duty, you could say. So another reason why this question is so important is because there are so many misconceptions about land back, which we'll get into. But we want to really articulate, because this is a watershed moment for Indigenous peoples, and we want to be really clear about what we mean and how we can do it in a constructive and effective way. So I will go first to you, Regina. Would you be open to sharing with us? And you have 8 minutes. Each panelist has 8 minutes, but if you don't need that long, that's fine. If you do go around that time, I might give you a little nudge. But don't feel pressured to use all 8 minutes, but it's there if you want it. So Regina, what does land back mean to you?
Well, first and foremost, what it doesn't mean to me, let's start there, is it does not mean a land grab. And I think that that's one of the biggest assumptions that many people make, is that it's just another way for groups to grab land. And, one of the things that I really want to express is that in order for tribal governments to take land back, that's a very, very complicated process. It's also very, very expensive, and pretty much is an act of Congress in a sense for tribes to be able to take land and maybe even take it into trust, which is a land status. So, one of the things that I want to share is that that's not the way I look at it individually. That's not what inspires or generates energy to do the work that I do around this type of concerns and this type of issues that currently exist with our land. What I do want to share is exactly what Lila mentioned just a few minutes ago, that in our way, and it would be very fitting for the females to be the ones to kind of guide this conversation, because in the act of rematriation, this is where we're going back and introducing our people to these lands. For me, land back means a very beautiful way for us to access the lands, maybe very similar to the way that we did. My people always believed, the Ute people believed, we didn't own the land owned us. We're accountable, we are responsible for taking care of this land. For some of us who are born into families that our family members were leaders, like medicine men, spiritual leaders, or even war leaders, family members assumed responsibility of service to people. And this is how we had to take care of not only our people, but how we take care of what we provide and how we seek to help, again, provide to take care of our people. So there was never a time that we could be or even begin to feel entitled to these places, because we were preparing the land to share with others. When it came to harvesting and taking certain goods from the land, we only harvested what we needed, because we always had this in the back of our mind that there would be someone, something, whether it was tomorrow or down the road a few months or years, somebody was going to follow us, whether that was other generations. And so when we look at the process of what access and what land back for me means, it's access to traditional plants, herbs, resources for which we utilize during the seasons of movement of my people. And so when we think about the work that's involved today, this is something that I hold very, very close and dear to my heart. I want to help others understand what that act of rematriation looks like, but also to help reintroduce, which is all in the process of rematriation, my younger people and people of my community. And in light and in lieu of our people being displaced from our traditional hunting and gathering locations, we have to understand we have been away from these places. Now it's time to come back into these spaces and be able to try to mimic what was done and utilizing the knowledge of our ancestors and elders. So with that, that's what land back means for me, but that's also what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that it's an opportunity to initiate the process of a land grab. It is very different. And that's something that I want to impress upon people with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina. I really appreciate that reminder that it's really about access and the ability to carry out our sacred obligations to take care of the land. And it's hard when the very thing that Creator put you here to steward, you can't even get into the fence line, you know? One time I was driving through Texas and I was going to they call them the Indian mounds now, but they were Comanche prayer sites. And I knew I had to go and I knew I had to honor the ancestors. But when I was driving there, it was surrounded by oil fields, you know, the oil, I forget what you call them, wells, yeah. And also the fences were everywhere. And as I got closer and closer to the Indian mounds, as they were called, I saw a dead wolf hanging from the barbed wire fence because people had been hunting the wolves there. And it was just a sad place, you know, that our sacred site was literally inaccessible. But I still went through the fence anyways, and I went to the mounts and I put down the prayers, and it was like the land was so happy to see me back. It felt like it had been, you know, decades, maybe even a century or more since prayers had been put down in these places. So I love that definition of access, you know, the access to and access to those relationships, you know. Okay, so let's go to Doreen. What does land back mean to you? And thank you again so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to actually thank Regina for going first. You know, because there's ways in which we can feed off of those. So and the stories in which we can share. So also, Lila, thank you for that, because again, you made me think of something else. I guess I'm struggling with which piece to start with first. And so know that this isn't necessarily first, second. It's just because we got to, you know, we move in terms of time. That one of the things I want to name more specifically is that even that the very kind of connotation of land and particular land and boundaries of land and borders of land is like, we need to like start way back. And I actually refer to it oftentimes as like pre-colonial. And it makes me think of like, at times people will talk about prehistoric, and I never can understand prehistoric because it's like, how did we as Indigenous peoples exist before history? Like it's bizarre. But going back there, go back there, right? Because this is to me one of the most important things that we need to acknowledge is all land is Indigenous land, and particularly here in what we would consider North America, right? And because that, I think that says something different in terms of particularly when we might get to this question about what do you do? Because if we compartmentalize this off in these kind of chunks, or again, maybe in a particular treaty naming of some kind of lot of land or whatever, I think we're missing a number of things, which gets me to particularly the two other pieces that I think are critical in this conversation. And I've actually tried to think about, and I'm actually really like way off of social media. I don't do it. I don't really know how to do most of it. I don't have time for it, but I do teach, and I'm trying to get with that generation. So I kept wanting to think about what would be a good hashtag. I know land back is this hashtag. Yep, I think part of why we're meeting today is even to talk about what does it really mean, because people have had a kind of distorted and or limited perspectives of what that means. So I kept trying to come up with another one, because the two words that I think about heavily when I think of this movement per se, and again, I would put that in quotes because this movement has been happening with Indigenous peoples since time immemorial, since we've been here, but the two words I think about are reparations and responsibility. So if we're going to do this in terms of taking away things, and I think about reparations very particularly, and it was in the description for tonight. So I kind of want to call that out in terms of like, it's already in there in terms of what we're thinking about. And I want us to think about reparations, particularly for this audience more, because there's responsibilities that I think can show up very distinctly in terms of us, in terms of, our tribal traditions, our nation, responsibilities and principles. And some of those, are going to be in our spaces. And that's part of tonight, maybe too, is that we learn that this isn't about everybody being at everything and everything being open for everybody kind of thing, right? So there is responsibilities, but even in some ways, as Regina said, is that if we're being prohibitive of that, if Lila has to jump the fence and like maybe even take down the wolf, right? Because that's what we would do, right? But if that's part of our struggle to fulfill our responsibilities as Indigenous peoples, that's something in which we need our accomplices, right? And we need those allies. And we may jump the fence together, right? Right, so to fit into that, right? So I do think that that's an element that's really important in terms of thinking about that doing in action. Yet I really want us to think about reparations more. And what does it mean to do reparations, land reparations, and particularly as Indigenous tribals peoples? Because we're still thinking about it, I would say too simplistically, that it has to be this piece of dirt, or it has to be this, again, this configuration of land. That what happened and why we need land reparations is because we were forced to change our ways of living. And we want to understand that in a much more totality, in a much larger way. And this is where we might get into some other examples, because when we're forced to change those ways of living, our education changed, right? This is issues. Our education systems are issues. Economic opportunities are issues. Environmental justice are issues. All of those things are the issues in which land reparations literally is beckoning. It absolutely has to. If we're going to look at land and our responsibility of stewardship with land, we need to expand land reparations and go past some of the things in which I think people are really getting stuck on is who owns things. And I really get worried about who owns. And in a more recent conversation, I had asked people were asking this question about like, well, do we serve this population or do we serve this population? And I said, I think the problem is that you're looking to serve people. And my question is, what do we serve? And what do we serve, again, is going to go back to this stewardship and responsibility that we have to the land, which is an honoring of our ancestors and an honoring of our traditions, and then also really paying attention to our obligations for our futures. But what do we serve changed the trajectory quite significantly, I believe, when we start to look at what does it mean to be involved in this movement, right? And again, going back to these ideas of reparations, I did take some notes as we're doing some of this, because if I'm understanding my relationship, and particularly that relationship I have with land, I have it heavily. The Muscalera believe that life is a great mystery, and I believe that this is honestly one of the most significant gifts that I have, is that life is a great mystery. And in that mystery, though, I'm a learner. Like I actually am in the process of always learning and knowing and telling. And I learn from the land. And I learn with the land. And I learn by literally falling on the land. And I learn by watching the birds. And I learn by how the tree smells, right? You know, there's all these different things that's what land reparations is about. And again, we can get a little too, I think, truncated around what those may represent and or what we need to do that. And again, we're going to try to share some examples, but I wanted to put in there that this is about knowing, this is about knowledge production, this is about, you know, who are your knowers. This is definitely part of what land means and why it's so necessary for us, if anything, to get it back away from the capitalist, away from the kind of rape and pillaging and the mining and the massive agriculture. Like there's all kinds of processes that have destroyed the land in the fundamental way in which we need to have a relationship as all peoples. And that's, so there's all kinds of examples that I think about in terms of that kind of way in which we might do then again, land movement and land reparations. Again, reparations being really key to that. I wanted to then also just mention that I want to think about this in terms of kind of who leads. And I want to make this point because of a larger, wider audience. I think it is significant. And in some ways, Lila, you mentioned in terms of kind of the feminine energy, and that can be.
And Doreen, you don't need to end now. I'm just letting you know you're at the time, but go ahead and feel free to finish your thoughts.
Okay, let me just finish this real quick, because I don't want people to misinterpret when we're making advocacy for Native women to lead. Because this is about a type of leadership, not just particular bodies. And part of what has happened, though, is that Native men have been put into leadership positions and taken away from some of their other traditional responsibilities. So the whole thing gets off balance. And it's not just the fact that we need Native women, but how we have pushed Native men into particular roles in which they also struggle fulfilling and not being able to fulfill the roles in which that would be traditional to us. So I just wanted to end on that in terms of like, let's make sure that we're fleshing out that this isn't about particularly just bodies, types of bodies leading, but types of ways in which we lead. And that what has happened to us as tribal peoples is that the men have also been kind of, violated in the process of what we expect them to do. And we actually need all of us to get back to those gifts and those responsibilities that we have within our tribes and our nations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate I honestly was not expecting either of your answers. I'm really appreciating the nuance and the depth and the insight you're bringing to the land back conversation. And we just thank everyone who's here. We really appreciate your presence. And I love your focus on reparations, because if you really go back to all the little laws and events that happen for people to own the land they have, if you go back far enough, it's always brutality, violence, and theft. Every single acre. I hate to say it, like almost every acre. And many of these nations who are forced to sign treaties ceding certain land bases were signing at gunpoint. We're signing after their people had been massacred. That's not a choice. Like with the Diné people, we were released from the concentration camp outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We were released from the concentration camp on the condition that we give our children to the government, ages 6 to 16. And the Mescalero were there, but they were cool. They escaped. But anyways, that's a different story. But anyways, these aren't choices. These are treaties signed at gunpoint, treaties signed after very challenging. Imagine at Auschwitz, folks being like, all right, we'll let you out if you give away your entire nation or something. That's not a true purchase or a selling. That's a immoral and unethical means of gaining access to lands. So, okay, enough of me. Crystal, would you be open to sharing with us, what does land back mean to you? And I know you're starting a little late, so go ahead and do 8 minutes from now if you want, which is like, 46 past the hour. Feel free to not pay attention to the schedule I sent out earlier.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, I will say that for me, land back means a lot of things. As you can hear you're going to hear clear differences in how we're working and doing this work between all three presenters this evening, and it's all of it. And frankly, it's all the things. But what I will say is that for me, as an Oglala woman, as a Northern Cheyenne woman, I was raised in ceremony, and I was taught in our songs, and we have songs specifically that tell us we are the land, right? And that is the core of everything that I do, is I move from that place of knowing that I have original instructions placed in me to be in relationship to the land, the giver of all life, and the life source for all of us to even be here today, right? And that's where I move from, and that's the core of it. And land back for me is the literal reclamation of land, period. That's what it is. It is us reclaiming land. And there's many different ways in which to do that, many different methods, strategies, tactics, all of the things. But at the end of the day, Indigenous peoples were forcibly removed from our lands, and we are fighting and have been fighting since the first settlers hit our territories to reclaim our lands. And that's what land back is for me. And it is also the reclamation of everything stolen from us when we were forced to remove from those lands. We were fully thriving economies and communities and societies pre-colonization. And so therefore, what was stripped from us was our languages, our ceremonies, our culture, our way of life, our way of being, our identities, but also food systems, governance systems, kinship systems, how we relate to each other, healthcare, education, housing, all of those things that create fully thriving economies and societies was stripped from us when we were forced to remove from the lands. And so our work is to also reclaim those things. But that has to start with literally, as they had said, having access to the lands. But for me, having access to the lands without having asked for permission. No one asked for our permission when we were forcibly removed. No one. And instead, what happened was a series of policies that attempted genocide on my people and that massacred nation after nation after nation to claim our lands and to remove us from our lands. So it has to start with reclaiming land. And that can happen in many different ways. But I think that we have to understand that everything that Indigenous peoples experience in our communities, high suicide rates, high alcoholism rates, diabetes, cancers, high dropout rates, all like sexual assault, violence, MMIW, all of these things, they have a root. They have a root cause. And that is when we were forced to remove from our lands. You can trace all of those things back to those times. You can follow the historical accounts in the stories that are passed down from our relatives, our grandmas, our aunties, our uncles that had to endure boarding school, that had to endure the longest walk, that had to endure being removed to Indian territory in Oklahoma and make that journey home, and we can track those things back. So therefore, for there to be any justice, in any reparation, in any reconciliation, it has to start with reclaiming land. And that's the bottom line for me. and that manifests in many different ways. For example, there's land trusts. Land trust is a totally tangible way to reclaim land that I believe in. There are co-ops that exist between Black and Indigenous relatives that come together and create cooperatives that are on the land and that are being in deep relationship with the land. There's the gifting of land back to Indigenous nations, right? And I heard it talked about Regina earlier about how that is a difficult process to move fee simple land into trust land. It's a massive undertaking, but it's possible. It's always possible. And so that can happen, gifting land, purchasing land. We have many nations all across the West Coast currently actively purchasing land back and expanding out their territory and their traditional land bases right now, presently. And that's happening across the board. There's also, occupations. I do believe in nonviolent direct action. I do believe in that. And occupying our traditional homelands and our territories is well within our rights to do that. And that's what we do. And we support those. Our relatives that have treaty rights and that have every right to be on those lands and move back onto those lands and live there and embody their traditional roles as caretakers of the land, they have every right to do so. And it's always often after they've already exhausted every legal avenue that has been presented to them. And that was their last resort. And that's what they do. And we support them in that. It's also co-management, only if this co-management is going to move us into a place of full repatriation of the land, into full reclamation. Will we move into co-management as a step? There's many different stories of success of that happening for many of our nations. I'd also say land taxes. There's communities, especially in the Bay Area with some of our relatives with the Sogorea Land Trust, and they are actually taxing settlers who live on their territories and live on their lands to be able to take that monies and purchase back larger land base so that they can simply have access to the land. They can simply be in relationship to the land. That is a very valid way. All of which are forms of reparation, just different tactic, just different strategy of doing that. And I think that for me, it's important to talk about land back, as a meta narrative as well, similar to that of our Black relatives with Black Lives Matter. It's a narrative that exists that encompasses so much organizing. And it's a movement. Land back is a movement. It's a full-blown movement that's all across Turtle Island and beyond. I'm really blessed and fortunate to be in the position I am in because I get to work across the globe, across all of Mother Earth with land back organizers who are fighting to reclaim their lands right now. And that's a really powerful experience to witness and to see, and I think that we have to also acknowledge that, I work with a campaign, like land back is also a campaign now. And that's the work I get to do. Every single day, I get to be out there and support our relatives who are just trying to be on the land, who are just trying to have access to their medicines, who are just trying to hunt without having to go through the state for permission, who are just trying to live their lives free of oppression and racism and white supremacy. And that's happening. And I'm really blessed to be able to do that work. And we do that, the cornerstone of our work right now with the Land Back campaign is around the Black Hills, the Heisapa. That's where our origin story tells us we came up out of the earth with instructions to be in relationship with the earth, to care for her, to steward her. And we have Mount Rushmore, the ultimate shrine of white supremacy that exists in the heart of our sacred lands. And so that's the cornerstone of my campaign, is reclaiming that land and that territory and public lands and federal lands across the whole United States, and supporting other organizers that are working on that front as well. We have many different ways. We have political education platforms. We have a narrative strategy. We provide movement support to all organizers that are working with specific strategies to reclaim land. And we have a land back agenda that will be rolling out in early 2022. And that's going to be like our political demands, knowing that we have to still interface with this US government that basically came in and occupied and built this so-called country over the top of us. And so with that, we do have political demands that are executive, administrative, and legislative demands and policies that can be enacted that create the conditions for our peoples to reclaim land, And so we have many different ways that we go about this. And land back is a very massive thing. And at the core of it, in the heart of it, is reparation. It is responsibility. It is having access. It is all of those things. And at the end of the day, it is literal reclamation of land. We are literally out here trying to be and have access without permission to our own lands that we were forcibly removed from. I'll end with saying that, land back is also a call to action. It's something that, like, our president and CEO, Nick Tilson, always says this, that land back is something that lives in the hearts and the minds of all Indigenous peoples. And we have been fighting to protect and to reclaim our relationship to these lands since we were removed. And that it just now has become popularized in terms of like a hashtag, right? And in terms of like the framework land back. But the reality is we've been doing this work, and I stand on those shoulders of my ancestors who gave their lives, who sacrificed freedoms to be able to just be on their land. I stand on their shoulders. They passed that down to me. And now it's our job as this current generation to carry that work forward, and to do that with a diversity of tactics and by any means. But I'll end with saying that. Check.
Thank you so much. It would make sense that you as a land back coordinator would have a lot of very pointed examples of land back, and we really appreciate that. And that's actually what we're about to get into as well with Regina and Doreen. They have some experience with various examples of what we're now calling land back. And I want to give a brief example too. Have you ever experienced something for the first time and realized that you've been missing it your whole life, but you didn't know you were missing it until you experienced it? Maybe it's being in a relationship with someone who treated you well and you were like, wow, this is possible. Yeah, because you never had that. Or maybe it's simply knowing your language, learning your language, and feeling the beauty of being connected to your ancestral language, no matter where you're from. Well, I had that experience the other day in a place called Alabama. I was in Muskogee homelands, and one of our relatives, or a group of our relatives, Muskogee relatives, they purchased over 700 acres of Alabama back. And I'll put their website in the chat in a little bit, but I walked into this land base, 700 acres, and they had brought sturgeon back to the land for the first time in 100 years. They had started burning the land in the traditional way to take care of the longleaf montane pine. They had brought buffalo back to Alabama that hadn't been there for a long time. And what was beautiful about stepping onto this land was feeling like I was free for the first time. Because even when you're on a native reservation and it's technically your land, it doesn't feel free, because ultimately the government runs that whole thing. The federal government is holding that land in trust for Native people, but ultimately has the final say. And there's so many BIA bureaucracies controlling the reservation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But when I stepped onto this Muskogee homeland, and I knew they had, like Crystal said, they didn't have to ask anyone permission. In fact, people had to ask permission from them to come into this 700 acres. But what was also beautiful about it is it wasn't just 1 acre plopped inside of a bunch of Euro-American farmers surrounding them, or what have you, but it was big enough where it really felt like an Indigenous space. And I could not believe how foreign this feeling was to me as a Native woman. I was like, wow, this is what it feels like to be free. This is what it feels like to be home. And it wasn't even my homelands, but just to know that the Muskogee were doing their dances there, were doing their ceremonies there, and they had complete autonomy over the ways in which the land and water would be managed and stewarded, bringing back the river cane, bringing back the sturgeon, bringing back all these endemic species. It was just strikingly beautiful, and at the same time strikingly sad that I had never felt that before. Anyways, I'll stop blabbing, but let's move into Regina, if you don't mind. Would you be open to sharing with us what is an example of land back that you know of that has been successful or at least taught us good lessons? Because I think as Native people, one of our greatest teaching tools is storytelling, to give people concrete examples, concrete stories of how this actually has unfolded, to give us the remembrance that it's possible to keep on doing it in other places too. So please, Regina, if you wouldn't mind sharing, what's an example of land back that you have seen unfold?
So in 2016, President Obama designated 1.35 million acres in southeastern Utah as Bears Ears National Monument. And I had the honor to sit on that coalition of 5 sovereign nations: the Dene, the Pueblo of Zuni, Hopi, the Ute Indian tribe of Utah, and the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. And in that time, we were able to lobby President Obama and his staff to bring forth more and to ensure that not only access, but use of the land. But one of the other pieces that I don't know that we've quite covered, but also to ensure protection of these places. It's one thing to gain that access back, but it's another to ask for adequate protection for the next generations, for 12 generations down the road. How do we want them to be able to access this? And through this effort, we were successful in getting 1.35 million out of a request of 1.9 million. So when you do the math, that's not too shabby. We didn't do too bad in that. But all that came of that, and how we made our case and arguments were the strong ties to this specific area. But we also had to take a look at a lot of the threats that were present out on the land. And one of the biggest threats is humans, ourselves. And one of the things that through telling and sharing the stories and learning about one another, now mind you, the Navajo or the Dene and the Hopi have been longtime enemies, as well as the Utes and the Denes. So to be able to heal our own relationships so that we can continue to lobby for protection, access, and through telling our stories and our ties to this land, the rematriation was the biggest piece that helped forge this conversation forward. Unfortunately, we got to see it downsized back when President Trump redacted the boundaries, but very recently, just a few weeks ago, President Biden reinstated those boundaries, and now 1.36 million acres is now designated as the Bears Ears National Monument in southeastern Utah. The reason why I give a little bit of this background about this area is this also kind of woke up the females of the different groups that were out there and helping to provide information and to want to go down this road. And they formed a group, and now they call themselves the Women of Bears Ears. And the biggest part that the women bring forth is the act of rematriation. We recognize that the females are the knowledge keepers. They are the children, the child bearers. They are the ones who have to care for homes. And that is very fitting, because even when you think about the lodges and the ancestral Puebloan dwellings, it was always the females who were the heart of those places. They were also the hearts of those ceremonies that needed to take place. And so when you think about that, what did that mean? That helped the women recognize what their roles were, because in society today, we're always taught that the men are the providers. The men are the ones who have to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But back in our day, the females were the ones who helped find those sites, put up the teepees, and did a lot of this stuff. So to recognize that maybe things were turned around a little bit through the re-education of our people through the onset of colonialism, now we're trying to undo that and reteach our own through the access and what that really means. The beauty and the success of that, these women get to sit down and talk with each other. They get to share these moments. And for so many generations, I think we've all been operating in our little silos because that's how we were taught in school. This is how things are done. But what we know is, and this is kind of funny because in school, you know, anybody that was Native and you knew they were Native American, no matter what tribe. In Indian way, we used to say, that's my cousin, that's my family. Everybody was family if you were Native American. And so that was something I think we kind of went away from, and also acknowledging the land, the elements and everything that's natural out here is actually a part of our family. They are who we are. And so, you know, I think that that was a huge success to be able to continue to assure our elders and our communities of access to this very sacred space, and also to ensure protection. So for me, that's a very successful story in terms of gaining that access back to land, because we're very strongly tied to these areas, and we continue to use these areas as active parts of our culture, our ceremonies, and collecting and harvesting herbs out on the land. So it is something that I would say is a great example of what land back could be, but also it also represented a collaborative effort between conservation groups and other NGOs, some grassroots efforts. It took the collective group to be able to move this forward and to recognize it wasn't just an Indigenous issue, it's a human issue. And it's important that we all look to it today, because we're not just faced with those land issues, we're faced with climate change. And the only way we're going to mitigate some of this is together.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Yeah, the Bears Ears struggle is an amazing and miraculous victory. And please Google it if you would like to know more about how exactly these groups organize and the legal tools through which this land was able to be rematriated to the local nations. Doreen, I ask you the same question. What's an example that you are interested in? And we are running a little over time, so if you would be open to keeping it to 5 minutes, that would be great. That way we could have some time for Q&A. But yeah, please feel free to share.
I feel like I better put myself on a timer. Well, no, and I definitely want to keep it open for a conversation, but I want to reemphasize that we're giving you an array of options and ideas, and be careful of the kind of like, where do you rank things, right? Because I think different circumstances are going to provide different opportunities. But I'm going to mention a couple things back. Crystal, you remind me very significantly when I was in upstate New York, and this is actually in the late 1990s and 2000. There are things that actually legally have already happened that would make such a difference if we had people who are supporting those initiatives. So this is when literally the state of New York was taken to federal court by the Haudenosaunee, and they were found in violation of literally the treaties in which land was taken. And the courts actually wanted to give them money. This is also similar to a couple other court cases. And the tribe said, no, we want the land. And what happened though is people didn't understand that it wasn't necessarily just getting the land back, but the land tax, that example that you're talking about. So this is a way in which we need to think more creatively about what those things can mean and how those things can happen, right? And I want to emphasize that because I do think that there's many more opportunities when we start to broaden the ideas in which we have, which also then gets into the different ways in which we can have access, stewardship, because even as much as we are anti-capitalist, there's no doubt that money makes things move, you know? So there's some reality there that's also part of where we need to see how we can play in the system in the ways that are healthy and respectful. But I mentioned that also because, again, that's 25 years ago, and that court case was in the 1970s. So that's almost 50 years ago. So again, tribal peoples have long been fighting for this in different ways to actually engage their own stewardship. I wanted to mention that I was heavily involved with a buffalo restoration project up in Wind River, the Shoshone, Northern Arapaho, that was really community-based. And I can give you examples like that, but I want to mention a couple other things, again, to broaden this idea, particularly because I want more accomplices in our lives, and I'm going to give you a close with an idea of that one too. So again, legally, push for more situations in which our rivers, our lakes, and lands get personhood status. And again, this has happened, in which personhood status gives very different rights around treatment of land and what we need to do in terms of even restoring land. So another project that I was involved in briefly, and it got put on hold for COVID, but we have lands even as tribal peoples, but they're heavily contaminated. So I'm thinking of the Navajo. We were down again in some of the chapters, and the uranium toxification and things that are going on there. So we need that work to also do that remediation of our lands because of all those things that have happened in those spaces. That's part of this movement. It makes me think of agriculture and doing promoting more agriculture that's no tilling, no pesticides. All those things come into our land in a variety of different ways. And that's polluting our waterways. And water is certainly a big, big issue. And it's going to continue to be something that's actually very, very contentious. So who has water rights? Who has water access? Where the water is going? How are we making those efforts? Two big ones. Push more municipalities to divest, because we can push the divestment, which again helps us in terms of the kind of quality of land that we have. Decolonizing wealth, really good process to do, again, from an Indigenous person, in terms of if you're in organizations, you can decolonize that wealth. That again helps in terms of some of our land movements and the things in which we're trying to prioritize and make healthy. And it makes me think of, I was in the periphery actually involved and aware of the land that was returned to the Maori in New Zealand. And one of the primary conditions that they did with that it wasn't just land that was returned, but it was also resources to fund the restoration of that land. So we have to look at those kind of situations in terms of not almost hindering or placing more obstacles on tribes to take care of things in which have been so brutalized in a variety of different ways in terms of the damage that has been done to that. And again, the damage to people, the Buffalo Restoration Project, it's so significant beyond what it means as traditional peoples to have buffalo, but what buffalo means to the land. So this isn't just this simple thing as an animal, but buffalo are extremely healthy for the land, which are healthy for the birds, which is healthy. So all of these things connect. So that's the other thing that I would like to emphasize. And the last thing I'll say, because I know I'm running out of time, is there's an example that even the title of this article I thought was really striking, because it's the title of the article is in The Guardian. The title of the article, you can read it, is "A pod of orcas are starving to death and a tribe has a radical plan to feed them." And the radical plan literally is that they're going to feed them live salmon. So I also am like, what the hell is so radical about that? Holy shit, right? But in the spirit of accomplices, can we also be radical? And that's where I'll end.
Oh, thank you. That was impressive that you fit all that in. But I love what you're saying. It's not just returning lands, but giving nations the funding needed to repair that land. I love that, because I know a tiny bit about the Black Hills movement. The Black Hills are the most sacred area to a number of nations, including the Oceti-Sakowin, Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, incorrectly and derogatorily known as Sioux, and also the Tsetseste, the Cheyenne, and various nations. The Black Hills in South Dakota are everything. It's everything to this nation. And so they were trying to get the land back, but folks were saying, oh, well, you need a plan first, you need to show how you're gonna. But I love what the Maori did. It says, no, give us the land and give us money so we can organize and fund the creation of that plan. When you think about foundations giving money to community groups, they often give them a planning grant, right? A planning grant, give them $100,000 to get ready, to get everything in order, so that when the time comes to fund the actual project, they give them another $500,000 to do it. But I love that idea, not just giving the land back, but I love the Maori, right? They always kick it up a bunch of notches, but to return the resources that the lost capital that could have been accumulated over time if they had access to those lands all these decades and centuries. return that too, so that they have the funds they need to prepare to steward and upkeep that land. Okay, I'm gonna stop blabbing. Crystal, you gave us a number of kind of shooting off examples, but is there a specific example you want to share more in depth of land back that you have found to be successful? And again, thank you for being here.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of examples. As you might know, I also wanted to start by, I mean, I don't know if we're gonna get to this and we have time, so I'll squeeze it into my little 5-minute piece, but like misconceptions around that is like, you know, there's fear attached to land back. Like, we're not coming after people's private property. Like, I just want to say that out loud. I feel like it needs to be said out loud, especially with like this audience. I feel like no one's coming after private property. No one's coming after anyone's houses and homes. Like, we're talking about like 1%ers, y'all. Like the folks who have the majority of the wealth in this entire world. Like, we're coming at those folks. We're coming at like federally managed lands, public lands, these places, right? And also, I push back on the idea that we would, as Indigenous peoples, that we would actually recreate the systems of oppression that we had to endure and live through is false. That's not true. When Indigenous peoples are back in relationship to the land, everybody benefits. All people benefit. That is a fact. Because what is it? Indigenous peoples make up 5% of the world's population, but we alone protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. That is a fact. And also, you know, we have some of the best forest management plans that exist in this country with the Yakama Nation. We have some of the best grassland management plans that exist in the nation with the Oceti right there in South Dakota, Nebraska. Those lands are managed by Indigenous peoples, all of which consume a lot of greenhouse gases that actually keep us from like spiraling down into climate change faster. So when we are fighting for these things, it is on behalf of all peoples. And we're not out here trying to recreate cycles and systems of oppression. We are fighting for all peoples to be able to live on an inhabitable planet moving forward. So I'll say that much to just clear that up. And I wasn't sure if there'd be time. The other thing is Camp Mini-Luzaha in Rapid City. I don't know if folks follow Indian Collective, but Indian Collective, we launched this organization, this grassroots volunteer organization. Also, my dog's in the background, I apologize. We launched this, you know, there's a creek patrol that went out and would actually check on our unhoused relatives who are unhoused because we were forced to remove from lands that exist in Rapid City. We would have to go out and actually make sure that the police weren't harassing them and assaulting them, and that white supremacists in the community weren't assaulting them and violating them in that, even just like for the simple fact that it was winter, that they weren't actually like dying from like freezing to death. And so people go out every single night. This still exists. They check on our houseless relatives. What Indian Collective was able to do is we were able to organize and work with the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, and Oglala Sioux Tribe to create an agreement about a tract of land that they reclaimed back from the federal government because it was unused and it wasn't being used for anything. And so they were able to petition to receive that land back. They received it back. We partnered with them and we created Camp Mini-Luzaha, which was a winter encampment that would actually keep our houseless relatives safe and warm through the winter, so we didn't lose any relatives. And we did that. We were able to do that, but because that was tribal land, it was almost like a little reservation island. And federal, like city and state police could not go on those lands because it was federal land. And what happened is we were in a situation where we were able to actually develop out services and ways to keep our relatives safe and ourselves safe without the police, without city services, without helping programs that get millions of dollars and actually don't really help. And we were able to actually serve and to provide safety and security and sobriety for a lot of our relatives that had never had that before since becoming houseless, right? And so we were able to do that. And that was all because we were able to get access back to our land. But by them being out on the land and contributing and sleeping there, it actually changed the dynamics. And so we know that it's like those successes exist. There's many examples. And as we said, this is not new. Like, these aren't new things. Doreen talked about a case that was 50 years ago. The Black Hills settlement was also initiated back in the 80s. Like, these aren't new concepts. these are actually ongoing struggles, you know? And so we're just like in a new iteration of what this movement looks like. I'll also name buffalo pastures, like, you know, the Wolakota buffalo pasture with Rosebud Sioux tribe. They reclaimed thousands of acres and now have a buffalo pasture that is fully thriving with our relatives, our buffalo relatives. KXL pipeline, my organization was able to purchase land right in the route of KXL pipeline and prevent them from being able to build the pipeline on that land. And then we're able to gift it back to the tribe, because that's who it should go back to. You know, we have Sagorte, we have as an example, and then we have the buffalo pasture in the Salish and Kootenai territory here in Montana, who started to co-manage land with the federal government for about 15 years. And then just this year, Secretary Holland coming in was able to actually sign, I think it was 18,000 acres back to the Salish and Kootenai Nation, because they quote unquote proved that they're able to manage those lands in that buffalo pasture, right? And so these successes already exist out there. The models already exist out there, and there is no one template for how this all happens. It is very unique to everyone's region, to everyone's nation, and to whatever communities that we're each organizing in. And so I'll stop with that. There's like a million examples I could probably give right now, but those are a few highlights that I have connection to.
No, we are very fortunate to glean from your immense amount of knowledge, and that goes for everyone here. Thank you so much to all three of you, Regina, Doreen, Crystal. It's been an honor to hear from you and bring so much complexity and nuance and beauty out of this very simple word, land back, and to really unpack it and weave together these different perspectives has really enriched me, I can say for myself, a lot just in this short hour. And I'm really grateful that we're recording this too, because Lord knows a lot of people are wanting to become more educated about this topic. So we will do our best to share that out after this webinar. We're going to move into Q&A. I'm sure there's so many questions, and we'll probably leave you with more questions with answers by the end of the night. It is 15 past the hour. Let's try to wrap up by 40 past the hour, 45 at the latest. We'll try to wrap up at 40 past the hour, so don't keep people too long. And if any of the panelists need to leave at 30 past the hour, we understand. We know you've already given so much of your time to this, but you can drop them in the chat. You can also raise your hand. If you go to the little reactions tab on the panel on the bottom, you can put raise hand and we will allow you to unmute yourself. We have a kind of strict security due to the Zoom bombing possibility. So I think there was one question in the chat. Let me see. Oh, no, not yet. And thank you for expressing your appreciation to the panelists. Please, if you have any appreciation, don't feel shy to show it in the chat. Okay, any questions, feel free. Oh, there we go. And Katie, feel free to help me because I'm on the phone, so I'm having some issues. But if you want to call on someone and unmute them, please feel free.
Yeah, Rick Williams, if you want to jump in.
Good evening. One of the things that we're trying to do in Colorado is ask that a $50 fee be assigned to every closing cost of every real estate action in Colorado. If that were to happen, it would generate about $22 million a year that could be used to reclaim land and restore sacred sites, help with the education of our people. All of the things that you ladies talked about are things that could happen if we had those kinds of resources. And I don't know if it'll ever come to reality, but when it does, I hope our allies are there to support us within the state legislature.
That's amazing. And I think it's good to have allies too, because I don't know much about real estate, or that I just learned about closing costs last year. I didn't know what that was. So folks who are in those worlds can create these incredible mechanisms like that. Rick, did you have a question for the panelists, or was that more of a statement, which is fine too? Comments are fine too. I think we might have muted him. I'm not sure if you can unmute. Would any of the panelists like to respond to that at all, or should we move to the next question? Okay,
I can
cool.
speak to that a little bit. Sorry
Yeah,
about
please.
that. He's absolutely right. I think the resource area and finding those collaborative relationships are really going to be pivotal in moving a lot of this forward. I know here in the state of Colorado, we are trying to do a lot of creative things, and even with some of the conservation groups, and how understanding that they really do recognize that they can no longer operate in their own silos, and that they also need that same allyship to move forward some of their initiatives forward. So we're all looking for what we can and how we can bring those resources to the table, as well as share to make those groundbreaking successes, as many of us have had the honor to do with Bears Ears.
Yes, thank you so much, Regina. We have a question for Crystal. Crystal, thanks for raising the example of what Indie in Collective has done in Rapid City. I'm wondering whether something can be done in places where there isn't a strong tribal presence. I'm thinking of Denver, where efforts to house people at the Four Winds American Indian Council property met with police harassment, zoning violations, and harassment by housed neighbors. So yeah, I guess the question is, can something be done like that in an urban, perhaps a rather place with less strong tribal presence?
Well, first, there is very strong tribal presence there. You just have to like seek them out and look for that. There is a very strong organizing front in Denver. And so I definitely don't want to overlook that. But also I would say, you know, I would say connect with them first and foremost, obviously. But what that brings, that question for me, what it brings up is conversation around like political analysis, right? So in our work with Camp Mestaa'ehehe, we not only had to recreate what our relationship looked like on the land there at Camp Mestaa'ehehe in Rapid City, which is an urban area, but we also had to call out and address the fact that the police were also part of the problem. And we had to take an abolitionist stance on that. And that's a reality too. And so it's important to connect all of these things and connect the dots. So if you look at this, LANDBACK is also a political analysis. It's our political way of looking at these things, which basically is, you know, Lila started out this whole conversation talking about terra nullius and talking about the doctrine of discovery opened the door for these lands to be claimed on behalf of a monarch because there were no Christians here. That was enforced by the US military and are what subsequently became the US military. US militarism is the largest polluter in the world. The largest single polluter in the world is the US military. And I say that as a veteran. I am a US veteran. And so it's important to connect these dots, right? So our removal from the land was enforced by the US military. And that template was then used to go overseas to access other Indigenous people's lands, remove them from their lands, and then claim resources there as well, which is now US imperialism, right? And the police were born from these things, right? So it's important to connect all of these dots and to understand the political analysis that exists, that if we are going to really truly reclaim these lands, it does become political. It does push us into these areas of calling out police brutality that happen when our houseless relatives, who are on their own lands, by the way, are being harassed by the police, then we must therefore call out the police for their behaviors as well. And so, like, to me, that's what that brings up. I know that wasn't the direct question that you had asked, but I think it was important to note that these things aren't separated. They're actually connected. And so I will say, connect with the folks that are there. Denver has a very strong organizing front. There's many people there currently organizing around specifically land back and reparations and having taxes. And so I would encourage you to seek those folks out and connect with them and ask what they need to be supported in that area.
Yeah, and I wanted to expound a little bit on the Sogorea Te' Land Trust that we keep invoking. It's in the Bay Area. It's run by Ohlone women and urban Ohlone women. And the Shumi, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but the Shumi land tax is a voluntary land tax that you calculate based on whether you rent or own, how much your rent is, or how many bedrooms you own. And based on that, they generate a number of like $50 a year, $200 a year. I think the most you would pay is like $500 a year if you have a huge mansion in San Francisco or something. And all of that money goes into a pot that is then used for cultural projects, including buying back plots of land in Oakland, including some of their projects or visions are bringing trout back to the rivers in Oakland. I mean, amazing stuff. And they talk about rematriating the land. So that's a beautiful model that can be used anywhere, literally anywhere. All you need to do is set up a website that can take a credit card swipe, and you have a Shumi land tax type of model. So I would like to ask this to Doreen, since you haven't spoken on the Q&A yet. And I believe you're in the area too, so this might be good. What is the best way to support land back in the Colorado area? Is there an organization like Segurate in Oakland that is actively collecting funds for purchasing land here in Colorado? What is the best way to support land back here?
I think that there's a couple different things that people can do. So this is one of the things too, where I think that people are asking, particularly some of the questions in the chat that are, Colorado based. So one, that even Rick Williams' example about the tax, and then somebody put in the chat, like, potentially getting realtor groups to do it if we can't get the state legislation to practice it. And I know, like, all of us, probably if you don't know a realtor, you know somebody who knows a realtor, because people have bought houses. So get realist. So to me, sometimes it's also coming at this from the verse. If we can't get it that way, we'll come at that way. Then we'll come back at that way again, which is the other thing around this issue with the 4 winds. Okay, so first, take some of these examples, and to me, I'm always thinking about, okay, so what would be the next step in that example? Right? So we can basically look at what Rick is doing and what that group is doing in terms of getting that passed legislatively. But if we can't pass that legislatively, and or while we're waiting for that, we get the real estate companies to do it. There's a lot of money happening in Colorado around real estate transactions. So I'd be doing that. The 4 winds, you're calling out the police, but I'm actually going to our council members and who's in that area and saying, look, we need housing for Indigenous peoples, how we're going to make this happening. This is what happened before. You can't drop it. We can't drop it because there's an issue. You got to come back to it. And that's where you show up again. And this is oftentimes one of the things that people say, like, what do I need to do? I'm like, you need to show up. And then you got to show up again. And you can't just run away when things get, they go whacked, You got to show up again. There's this obvious need. So I think about that. I think about, there is this other issue around, Denver has a really significant tribal population. It's an urban tribal population, which the distinction to that is that it's many tribal nations. So sometimes that's where people get lost about what to do. Yet I know that there's a number of parks. Daniels Parks is one in which the city has done some things to allow ceremonies there. There actually is community gardens that have happened more in some of these spaces. So again, just trying to multiply the ways in which we think about what to do in these spaces. And I will say that I've been in contact with a number of different city governments. I think, Lila, you started off the conversation, and so like this is like watershed moment. I can't remember what the word you used. It is. Yeah. There are a lot of people who are very interested in trying to figure out what we do. And we need to push those alliances, and we need to push people in terms of those spaces. There are a number of different private organizations or social organizations or more community organizations that I know that have been interested in this like literal purchasing of land. I've heard some of it happening more successfully with a couple other examples that Crystal offered in terms of like land trusts. And I've seen that happen a little bit differently and actually with some different success. I think one of the issues that we have in Colorado is, where's the boundary and whose line? And, I've been in communities and organizations where this city has an MOU with this 13 tribe, but then this one says that this should be 17. And then the state of Colorado says there's 48. So this is where some of it starts to get a little bit more, where you need to align with people in terms of what do we know and how do we serve that? And whether or not we're building artificial boundaries, I know some of the work that we've done down in Boulder County and a number of people in that in those efforts, it wasn't about one specific, there's 13 tribes that are involved with that. So go back to tribal consultations, and there's laws and policies around that. So there's a number of different things that I think are happening. I don't know of one group in particular that's like channeling the funds. It makes me think about, Rick, when we get all that money, who's going to be the organization, right? Because that's part of what has to happen. And I was actually just talking to somebody else today about like, can we leverage First Development Institute, which is a granting organization? And maybe there's a way, particularly when you have a granting organization already, it's a little easier than to do fund disbursement. You know, so those are some of the things that I would look at. The Colorado Trust is an organization that's really heavily involved across the state. So there are some, but I do think that Colorado's in this weird situation where the nations that we still have on their territories are in the southwest corner in terms of the Ute. And there's just a different way people relate to that, particularly compared to the Front Range. In the Front Range, we have just this different reality of how folks are engaging. So I think that there are movements, absolutely. But I also think that one of the complications we have is this urban mixed population. And again, you know, Denver was a select city during the relocation period. So we have a huge number of people from a variety of different nations. So that would be one of the other things in terms of like what's in the chat is we need to do more homework. Like, I feel like that's one of the things I tell people all the time too. You got to do your homework, which is like really understanding what are the issues, what are the possibilities, you know, so there is some of that where the homework might be today, but this can't be it. And even if we give you the recording, it can't be it. Like, you all got to do more homework, you know, and reach out. There's a number of organizations and we got to do some more reach out. So I know it's not specific in a name, but I definitely can think of some things that are going on. And I do think that there is this watershed, although now you're making me think like, what the hell is that metaphor for? What is that? You know, and how we can ride it maybe, you know, but again, there's only like 3 or 4 nations that are being mentioned in terms of Colorado. There's many more. So we're already kind of even over relying on particular pieces that have been given at different times. I don't know how many people even on this call know what I mean when I say Denver's a select city. This is why you need to do your homework so that you can better understand how we can actually serve and again, what we seek to serve in these efforts.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Yeah, no, that's amazing. And, you know, speaking of showing up and showing up and showing up and showing up and showing up, this coalition that called this call together is made up of an amazing group of people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, of course, Indigenous led, called I'm not even gonna say it right. One of y'all will say it correctly, but the Mestaa'ehehe coalition, which was instrumental and successful in renaming S Mountain very recently in Colorado. So amazing work, guys, you know, showing up. And they're actually on this call and they know a lot about land back in the Colorado area. Mestaa'ehehe, thank you, Mestaa'ehehe. And then if you could mute, okay, thank you. So I would actually like to ask you that same question, Fred Mosqueda, if you would, from Cheyenne Arapaho community in Oklahoma, where you presently are now. Would you be open to answering that same question? You know, what could be done about land back in Colorado now, or anything else you want to say about land back in general?
I have very limited knowledge or experience with this land back. I just know that there's some coalitions such as Rick Williams is one that comes to mind that really works hard on land back. But there's also there has been some issues that have come up with private landowners that want to work with the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes in possibly bringing in buffalo, bringing in some other industry or, you know, economic development in lands, and they wanted to like to co-own. And we are working in some of those census in Colorado, but we also are working with are supporting Rick in his endeavors also. So that's about, you know, all I know right now on land back is that we are aware of it and we are working with other private, you know, in some cities we work with them to possibly like for renaming and such as that. So thank you.
Thank you, Fred. And it's an honor just to even hear your voice. Fred has been instrumental in helping this coalition. And we also want to hear from you too, Rick Williams. We know you have done a lot of work. We'd love if you could share your video, but if not, that's fine too. But yeah, how would you answer that question? We know you just put in the chat that you've done People of the Sacred Land organization. Could you speak more about that and any other things that people can do in Colorado specifically to address land back?
Well, I think that, one of the things that happened was we began to research what happened and why there are no reservations on the Front Range or Eastern Plains of Colorado. And what we found is that it was genocide, and the people who lived here were completely wiped out and forced into other places. And that's what sort of began to drive us to say, well, what do we have to do to get our land back so our people can come home? What does that look like? We don't know, but we created the People of the Sacred Land, and most of us are descendants of people who lived here, to try to answer those questions and find ways to help our people, both in the urban areas and in the reservation communities at the same time. And we believe that land is a very important part of that. But also, one of the other things that we're going to be doing is we've created a Truth, Restoration, and Education Commission, where we're going to examine what was the historical economic loss to Native people in Colorado because of the transgressions of the invaders.
Very important work. Yes, please follow Rick Williams and the organization People of the Sacred Land if you're in Colorado. I know there's people joining from all over the country. We have some minutes left. So Katie, no, not trying to put you on the spot or anything, but if you wanted to share just why Mestaa'ehehe Coalition wanted to call this webinar, you're most welcome to, and you're also welcome to just say pass if you want to, but thank you for showing up and calling together, working to organize this, and congratulations to all of you on renaming S Mountain. I don't want to say the whole S word because it's as bad as the N word, but one of the mountains in Colorado was named a very derogatory term, and we recently had a success of renaming Mestaa'ehehe Mountain, which is amazingly beautiful. And now they're on to the next mountain. But you're welcome to, Katie, but no pressure.
I can just jump in real quick and kind of share how we got to sort of how we work as a coalition that brought us to this topic. There are a few of us allies, and we're led by folks from the Northern Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho, and Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, and as well as Rick is a part of that and other local folks. And then there's a few of us on the back end who just try to, put together the webinar and create the links and things like that. And when the coalition started, the big goal was, even if we don't rename any mountains, let's educate people. And so that's why we started doing webinars. And in one of our meetings, we've been discussing, what could the next webinar be? And Rick Williams and Fred and I can't remember who else was in the meeting, but folks had decided that would be a next good place to start because it's complex. There's a lot of different ways for people to engage in it and support. And it seems to be something that is happening across the country. So it would resonate with a lot of people. So that's kind of how we came to putting this together.
Wonderful, thank you. And there was a really interesting question in the chat that I want to come back to and pose to all the panelists, whoever wants to answer, please feel free. But they said, what's some information for those who want to will their land, their private lands, back to Indigenous nations? I know that's a big thing lately. It's beautiful. Either there are landowners who have no descendants and have a big chunk of land and want to make sure it goes to the right people, or be a part of healing history, healing the past. And so does anyone want to speak to how private owners, perhaps even people who are on this call who might be interested in deeding back lands to Indigenous peoples, any information on that or stories about that?
I think Crystal.
I was kind of looking at Crystal too for some reason.
Oh man, I personally haven't, I mean, our organization hasn't moved in that area, I will say. However, we have connected folks, you know, and I would say like the easiest route has been actually through nonprofits or returning directly to nations, right? So if you're returning it to a nation, like you have to go through that process of like transferring and moving land from like fee simple to like trust land, which is a massive process. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm not like the legal person here, so that I'm not even to pretend that I know fully what that process is. And also, you know, back to individuals. I've had a lot of conversations with folks who have built genuine relationship and wanted to will and gift land back and like will land back to individual indigenous peoples. That's their traditional territory. So I've heard of those things happening. And so it's a matter of like ownership just moving over. And then also back to nonprofits, right? And indigenous led nonprofits specifically who have that mission, right? That encompasses land back work, whether it's called that or not. And so I have heard of those things, but I'm not going to pretend that I know what the legal process is. But I know that it's possible. And I do know that it is happening more and more. And we're definitely connecting and kind of like referring folks to different communities that maybe they reach out from, you know, Nebraska, and we're like, hey, you can connect with the Santee Sioux, or, you know, we're able to do that. But outside of that, I don't know what the actual legal process is. I just know that it's pretty intensive. Check.
Thank you. Yeah, I think part of this watershed moment that I have observed is that not only are people thinking about giving land back, but also so many young Native people have visions right now, visions of how they're going to work with the land rather. And vision, like for instance, I have a vision of a sheep farm because my people have churro sheep, which have 4 horns. And this is the only type of sheep we can metabolize appropriately. My people are actually starving, eating all these European sheep because they're too fatty. And our DNA is not built to metabolize those European sheep. But the churro sheep are a hybrid of Spanish sheep and our mountain sheep. So we can metabolize that all day. And so my elders asked me to bring my sheep, our sacred animals, back to the people. So I'm like, okay, sure. And then I'm like, oh wait, I don't have any land. I'm like another landless Native woman, you know, like I've been renting my whole life. And so it's like, but it's not just me, you know, I can name a dozen more Indigenous, usually young women, but also young men and Two-Spirit relatives who are saying, hey, I would love to start a corn / education center. A lot of it always has to do with education. And so that's what I would say to people who are wanting to will their private lands back, is what Crystal said of like, to an individual, you know, create one more Indigenous person who actually owns land. It's surprising how many don't, you know, and we might have access to tribal, you know, what do they call it? Housing authorities, but that's not land. So many Dene people have this tribal housing authority that is not appropriate even to literally live in for anyone. And so, you know, that's what I would say. You know, there's so many beautiful young people with these amazing visions, and all they need is a couple acres, you know, and if you gave them 20 acres, oh my God, it would make their whole life so much brighter. So I'm tempted to wrap up here. We've all been so. Yep.
Can I just say, yeah, just a quick one too, because I'm like anxious if anybody's looking to give up land. I don't want it to make it like too. First thing I would say, there's no doubt if you're doing a will, somebody's going to have some idea even from that end, you know. So just take the steps. I mean, there's a part of me that wants to say take the steps even to Google because we can see like examples, but take the step first. You got to put it in your will. You got to put it in your own trustee, and then it would be, as Crystal said, contact the tribe in which you're considering that, and that would be the second step. But just know there are these, like, take those steps. So please take those steps. And instead of just kind of waiting for like us to give you a script or whatever, because I can guarantee you those 2 steps are going to get you moving in that right direction. So if you have any interest in giving land, or also, you know, if you have some spots where we can raise some sheep, we can like tap into that, or again, something even that it's local. Because again, there's a lot of interest. There's so many, you know, youth groups that are looking for land. that really are like that I can farm over here, or maybe I can have some of my elders come even from a reservation down to Denver or down here, and we can look at literally some of the original plants, and then we'll do a language immersion class with that, and we can look at what are some other traditional skills in which we would have done. I know that with the Buffalo Restoration Project that we were part of, one of the biggest things that they're excited about is like how you can bring back some of those crafts and skills back that become part of that process. So please take those steps. So take the first step again and take the next step. And I did look up watershed just for people to know. And it's fitting because it's the area where everything drains now to become a single river. So it's the movement that brings us all together. So anyway.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yes, thank you all so much. I've said this a million times, but it is truly an honor to be with all of you. I would like to give Regina a last chance to say any final words, perhaps, and maybe Crystal, and then maybe we can say goodnight for now. Regina, would you like to add any last words, or are you okay?
Sure. I just want to just right along with everybody, want to encourage people to do the research, establish a relationship with a neighboring tribe or any other or indigenous group out there. Really pack yourself full of knowledge before you start to go down these roads, because remember, it may be complicated on your end, but it also may be complicated on the tribal organizations end as well. So and whether you're wanting to know more about the land back, whether you're wanting to know more about the different efforts and campaigns and movements, I encourage everybody just to get out there, do some research, read. And I'll just share a bit of knowledge that guiding principles that my grandmothers used to share. You'll always be a student until the day you are laid to rest, and then your education moves into a different direction. So continue to be those wonderful students and learn, but also remember to share gratitude for everything you receive. Thank you.
Thank you. Crystal, any parting words?
I mean, I definitely echo that in terms of, I just encourage folks to just like ask the questions, just take the steps, as Doreen said, just do the things, because we all misstep. I misstep all the time, like every day I'm misstepping, and then I'm learning, and then I'm doing better. And so I think like it's especially important for allies to not become paralyzed in all of the like little minute details of how we could possibly, probably do this, when no, like we're out here just doing the work. And so we call on y'all to just be out here and do the work too. Just do the thing, misstep, learn from it, and come back again. And I think like that's the most important thing, is that we're just in this work together, and seek out those folks. As Regina said, I mean, there are indigenous struggles in every single so-called state across this so-called country. Like you will find a land back struggle, I promise you. Just look for it. And then also, I dropped in the chat, if folks want to sign up and just want to know more about some of the work that we're doing with my campaign, you can follow us at landback.org, and then just encourage you to follow the other presenters, panelists, Lila, and organizers of this in their work with Land Back too. Check.
Thank you. And Doreen, I suppose I should also give you, you're good. Okay, just making sure. Yeah, and I think I'll end just by saying, never forget the power of prayer. I have a friend who would pray every day that she would meet Diné people to restore her land base back at the foot of Cisnagen in Mount Blanca. And sure enough, well, not just Diné people, but Pueblo peoples as well, that's their homeland. Sure enough, we were running by her, or she was running by us one day when we were doing a pilgrimage. And so never underestimate the power of prayer, to just say, Creator, I want to be a part of this. I'm not sure how I can plug in, but can you show me a way to plug in? And something beautiful will come your way. I'm sure of it. So never underestimate the power of prayer to bring you to the places where you can support this in a good way. So thank you all so much. It's a huge blessing. Justine, I'm not sure if you can open that doc, but if you could just put the paragraphs directly into the chat, Justine, that would be great. But in any case, we have bios and websites for them in that document that Justine just posted for all the panelists. it's been an honor to spend this brief time with all of you. And please feel free to keep us in your prayers, and we will keep you in our prayers as well. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It's an honor to be with you. Have a good night. Bye.